Hi everybody, Professor Snart checking in here. Hopefully everyone had a good weekend and is finishing up or finished up their short story for our short fiction workshop. Just going to take a quick look at our due dates. So I'm not going to get us too far beyond the fiction workshop right now. You can always pop into later units, but we want to really focus our attention obviously on getting a fairly complete, although certainly still in draft phase, short story put together, posting by Monday, June 12th, which is when I'm recording this in the morning. And then, of course, providing feedback, which again is really like the most important part of our class. You'll find yourself in a group, so you'll be getting that feedback on your work. In this case for the short story, but for the other genres that we'll then cover as we move through our course. And it's getting that really quality feedback, what works, but also kind of what doesn't work or what needs attention, that can help to direct your revision, like on a really practical level, were you to revise that piece. But what you'll find is that we don't have revision built into our course because we just always move forward. But what you'll hopefully find, even in just a single workshop, but hopefully over the course of them, is that you learn about yourself as a writer. If you always tend to do certain things really well, maybe it's dialogue or interesting word choice or just whatever people comment on, or if you tend to make the same, and I don't even want to say mistakes, but if you just have the same kind of habits where you don't produce writing that is as effective or as clear as it could be, that will hopefully reveal itself if you're getting that quality feedback, maybe even just this one time from a group of readers, but certainly spread out over all of these various workshops that we do. And that to me is like the most important part of our course. Hopefully you learn from me, from the textbook, from the course content, some ideas about writing, creative writing generally, but it's really in the practice of it and getting that feedback from across a range of readers on multiple occasions that you develop a picture of yourself as a writer and what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. So again, I'd encourage people to review the earlier video announcement, but also information in our course on the workshops. The providing feedback part, we want to make sure that there's lots of feedback. It identifies strengths, but also areas for improvement, questions that we might have, suggestions for possible changes, right? But that it's throughout. It's not just one summative thing at the end or a couple of comments here or there. And like I mentioned in my earlier announcement, I really would caution people against trying to just comment as you read the first time. It's not really giving the work a fair shake. And so in the ideal workshop situation, we trust that our peers, our classmates, have invested time in creating a short story or poem or whatever genre we happen to be covering. And so we want to honor that investment of time by making an equal investment of time in providing useful feedback. And it's like, I think I mentioned in the unit, it's the golden rule, the way that you want others to treat your work, taking it seriously, providing good feedback, stuff that you can actually work with, is the same way that you have to sort of reciprocate in kind, right? Okay, so just a couple of little notes, especially for those who are maybe still struggling with the short story, or even if you found yourself challenged to write it, it's sort of good to take stock of why that was difficult. And a couple of little tips. So one is really practical, and that's coming up with story names. Sometimes it's funny how hard it is to name a character. There's you can get books from the library about 100,000 things to name your baby or whatever. And yet when it comes to a character, we want to find a name that's evocative, but not so weird if we don't want it to be too weird, and it's not too obvious, or it doesn't somehow point to some other person or figure in the world. We make a sort of accidental allusion. One of the little tricks that I've practiced over my years of writing is if you watch a movie or fast forward to the end of one, watch the credits roll and get past the really well-paid people and get down into the people whose jobs nobody really even knows, like the gaffer and whoever the assistant to the caterer is, whatever, all that stuff. Pull some names from there, and don't just pull a name verbatim. Pull an interesting first name and match it with an interesting second name. I know, pretty practical, but it's a fun way of A, watching movies, and B, finding some interesting character names. And I guess the thing to be conscious of is to name the character in a way that helps to shape that character. So maybe you can in fact allude to another more famous name of that type, whether in a first or last name, and you can even change it a little bit, like a character from Greek mythology or a famous, I don't know, contemporary figure, whatever it happens to be, so that your character now kind of alludes to, even in an ironic way, like it's named after something but doesn't at all behave like that particular character. They end up being sort of foils or opposites for each other. If you have a character who's very plain and whose story is really about having no story, then you want to choose an uninteresting name. Don't just default to the like John Smith. That's a little too obvious. But again, pull some names that are evocative of that plainness. And again, if you just sort of are stuck for names, the deep into the credits is a fun place to go. So that's pretty granular, right? The slightly more global advice, and this is again one that maybe people are struggling with now or even experienced in the writing of this short story and can use in the future, is that if you're just stuck for where to start, there's a couple of places not to start. The first one, and actually I'll only give you this one, the big one, is don't start with an idea. Like, I'm going to write a story about racism and how it's bad. We already know that. I'm going to write a story about gender politics. I'm going to write a story about the meaning of life. That huge, big umbrella thing. It's like, A, too much for a short story, and B, is so abstract that you're probably going to end up, because you're starting at that premise, with a very abstract story. It's going to lack the details that make good stories really interesting to read. And in fact, if you read the best short stories, they're really surprisingly about very small, granular things. It doesn't mean that they don't allude to or invite us to think about some of those bigger ideas, but if that's where we start as the writer, it's almost always a recipe for an ineffective or less effective short story. So the opposite or more positive advice is that, especially if you're stuck with a place to start, there's a couple of things you can do. The first is what writers call writing from an image or writing from a thing. And that is literally, looking around you and seeing what stuff is there. So I'm seeing a coffee cup, a stapler, a microphone, my cell phone, a digital clock, the usual desk, office-y type things, cup of coffee. Do that, right, at a variety of different places, and then begin your story with that cup of coffee or that digital clock and the time on it. And then write a story that sort of unfolds from that really, really microscopic thing, instead of, notice how that's the opposite, of starting with, oh, I'm going to write about world peace. That'll be interesting. It might evolve into that or have thematic sort of extensions outward, but your story needs to begin with the really particular and the specific. And you'd be surprised at how staying grounded like that leads you to really interesting places. And keep in mind that when we write, even if we start with the digital clock, for example, and a time on it, it's not like in the process of revision and editing that has to stay as the very beginning of the story. In other words, we might write ourselves to an interesting place by beginning with that really specific thing, that physical object that's surrounding us right now. But in revision, right, that what was our initial beginning might move and actually become more of that typical center. Or it might morph entirely and not really even be part of a later draft, but we have to start somewhere. So you get the ball rolling by writing about a really specific, tangible, physical thing. The other piece of advice is to browse through newspaper, especially one that's not local to you, although those can be good too. Libraries are great. Often they still subscribe to papers from around the world, newspapers from around the world. And of course, the web gives us access to all kinds of stuff like that. But don't, right, default to the big front page headline or the big news story. That's a little bit like, I'm going to write about world peace or some big, right, momentous thing. Go to that, the local section, whatever it might be called, or the kind of hometown section, and find an interesting story. And here's the counterintuitive piece of advice, or piece of this piece of advice. don't actually read that whole story. Skim it as quickly as possible. Get a sense of like what odd or weird or thing, right, happened. Even if it's not weird, it can be a great place to start a story. So it's local, somewhere it's specific, it's kind of small, it's not a big, momentous, life-changing thing necessarily. And you don't want to read the thing so closely that you feel kind of bound to retell that story. So that's why I suggest skimming it and just having like a really cursory sense of what sort of happened. And then that gives you some fodder to build your story around. In fact, if you can join those two things together, a quirky local story, local to wherever that newspaper is, that you kind of have a sense of what happened but aren't even really sure, and then grounded in a physical, specific object that you can begin to tell that story, that's a really good starting place. That's a great recipe for moving forward in a positive direction. Truthfully, the hardest part about writing a short story isn't really the beginning. We can overcome that pretty easily. It's unfolding a narrative that has sort of that rising action, some kind of crisis point or climactic point, and then that falling action per the pyramid that we looked at. So the beginning, honestly, right, the brainstorming part is kind of the easiest of them because there's lots of places to go for what to write about. It's the what happens next that becomes really challenging. Okay, so hopefully that's some useful advice, perhaps useful right now, but if it resonates with some of the challenges that you felt in writing this short story, then maybe it becomes really useful practical advice for moving forward, either with other writing that we do for the course or any kind of creative writing that you do outside of the course as well. Okay, there, I'll move my screen. A little bit of interest for you. If you have questions, concerns, want to be in touch with me, by all means, shoot me an email and I will get right back with you.